You're about to watch one of the most powerful illusions in American democracy shatter in real time, because when the Senate was given a chance to prove that no one sits above accountability, they didn't just hesitate, they ran from the sunlight. And what happened next has people across the country asking the same question. If equal justice under the law really means something, then why were the Epstein files kept in the dark once again? The moment this vote unfolded, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't procedural. It wasn't symbolic. It was a loud, unmistakable message about how far some leaders will go to protect the powerful.
Of the U.S. Supreme Court, the 4 words, equal justice under law. Equal justice under law. What does that mean to us who grow up in America? It means that nobody is above the law. Not a politician, not a celebrity, not a billionaire, no one. Now, we certainly know that this vision to which we aspire, equal justice under the law, has not been fully accomplished. But we wrestle to move closer to that vision, to realize that vision. And today, we had a chance as the U.S. Senate to move significant stride in the direction of saying no one is above the law. The legislation that was considered was an amendment form of a proposal that I had drafted to say, release the Epstein files. And my co-pilot, Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico, saying, release the Epstein files. And indeed, many members on both sides have believed in this vision of transparency and accountability. Why? Well, because they value those words that are carved above the pillars of the Supreme Court, equal justice and law. They cherish that value in their heart, that we aspire towards a vision where everyone is accountable. Plus, in this particular case involving Jeffrey Epstein, every single one of us, all 100 senators, know that Jeffrey Epstein was a monster who groomed and abused underage children, a monster who trafficked girls to rich and powerful men, a monster who destroyed the lives of hundreds of young women. As I speak, the U.S. Department of Justice has files detailing the names of those connected to Mr. Jeffrey Epstein. It's been widely reported that in May, our Attorney General, Pam Bondi, informed President Trump that his name appears in the Epstein files. But to be clear, just because a name is listed in the Epstein files doesn't mean that that person was a collaborator in abusing young women. There may be lots of names in that file related to just casual acquaintances or people met on trips, who knows? But some of those names in that file may well shine light on people who abused young women. So let's bring it to light. If we believe in that vision of equal justice under law, if we believe in accountability for all, then release the files. Let the chips fall where they may. It is the right thing to do. Everyone involved in assisting Jeffrey Epstein in running an international trafficking organization or involved in directly purchasing access to young women through Jeffrey Epstein or directly abusing young women proffered by Jeffrey Epstein, every single person, let the chips fall where they may. No matter how rich the person is, no matter if they held office in the past, no matter if they aspire to office in the future or sit in office right now, no matter how famous or not famous they might be. Let the chips fall where they may. That's the vision of equal justice under the law. Everyone involved in Mr. Epstein's crimes must be brought to light and must be held accountable. My colleague from Oregon, Senator Ron Wyden, and the Senate Finance Committee have been investigating Mr. Epstein's financial network for the last 3 years. The Biden administration fully cooperated with the Senate investigators on that case. The Finance Committee staff went to the Treasury Department to see the Epstein files and suspicious activity reports. Democrats understood that this was an ongoing investigation. We applauded the Biden administration for cooperating, and that was the right course. But now we're under a different administration. Instead of cooperating, the Trump administration is obstructing. The Trump administration and Attorney General Bondi are refusing to cooperate, and they are refusing to investigate further. They're simply saying 2 words: case closed. Case closed? When they have their hands on information potentially regarding dozens or hundreds of individuals who abused young women. So today we had a chance to vote on whether the case is closed. We had before us an amendment which said, deliver the files. Create the force of law, deliver the files. And 51 senators in this body, I am ashamed to say, said, hell no. We want them kept secret. We want to protect the perpetrators. Why? Because the man in the Oval Office, Mr. Trump, told us he wants us to protect those files, does not want them public. On July 17th, the Wall Street Journal reported on a letter allegedly written by Trump to Epstein as part of a birthday book.
Even when survivors have begged for years for a sliver of transparency, because behind closed doors, inside sealed folders and restricted archives, sits a collection of documents that could reveal who enabled, financed, or benefited from Jeffrey Epstein's network, and for the second time in a generation, the people with the authority to expose it chose secrecy instead. Senator Merkley described running up the steps toward the Senate chamber, racing to cast a vote that should have been simple. The question wasn't complicated. It wasn't partisan. It was this: do the American people deserve to know what's inside the Epstein files? For a country raised on the belief that equal justice under law isn't just a slogan carved into the Supreme Court but a principle we live by, the vote should have been an easy yes. Instead, that principle was tested, and failed. As Merkley reached the top of those steps, he turned and saw the words etched in stone: equal justice under law. Words every student learns. Words that shape the country's identity. Words that should matter. And then he walked into a chamber where 51 senators were prepared to say essentially not today. But to understand why that moment hit so hard, you have to understand what the Epstein files really include, because most people imagine a list of flight logs or a few names scribbled in a book. The truth is deeper, stranger, and far more consequential. These files include internal DOJ communications explaining who was protected, who was questioned, and who never was. They contain suspicious activity reports from financial institutions tracking unusual transfers linked to Epstein's network. They include summaries of grand jury evidence, travel records, flight manifests, and deals made behind closed doors. They include documents describing how decisions were made, decisions that shaped who faced accountability, who slipped away, and who was shielded entirely. Now, here's the part that matters: being named in these files doesn't mean guilt. Many names could simply be acquaintances, donors, old contacts, or people who crossed Epstein's orbit without knowing who he truly was. But hidden within those files are also leads, patterns, connections. The kind investigators follow when seeking truth. The kind journalists rely on. The kind survivors need to finally be heard without being questioned. And yet, instead of releasing this information with careful redactions to protect victims, the administration in power said 2 words: case closed. Think about the weight of that phrase. Survivors spent years gathering courage to speak. Investigators spent years untangling financial networks, tracing travel patterns, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing evidence. Entire committees devoted resources to understanding who enabled Epstein's abuse. And with a single decision, leaders said the case is over. The conversation is finished. The files stay sealed. That's why this vote mattered. It wasn't theater. It wasn't symbolic. It was the one moment lawmakers had to prove that accountability outweighs reputation, that truth is more important than protecting elites. Senator Merkley described how previous administrations cooperated fully with investigations into Epstein's finances. Staffers could walk into the Treasury Department, sit down, and review suspicious activity reports tied to Epstein's web of entities. There wasn't obstruction. There wasn't hesitation. There wasn't fear of sunlight. But under the current administration, everything changed. Instead of cooperation, investigators were met with a wall. Instead of transparency, they got silence. Instead of a willingness to investigate, they got a declaration that the matter is closed, even though documents still sit in government hands, even though survivors still wait, even though transparency was promised. When the Senate finally voted, 51 senators chose to table the amendment, effectively saying keep the secrets hidden. And Senator Merkley didn't hold back. He said plainly what many Americans have been thinking. This wasn't about privacy. This wasn't about active investigations. This was about shielding powerful individuals from embarrassment, scrutiny, or consequences. It didn't help that in the past few months, new pieces of Epstein's world resurfaced in public reporting. A birthday book with unsettling drawings and language. A novelty check with a woman's name blacked out beside a handwritten note, trivializing her humanity. Whether those artifacts were dark humor or something worse, they signaled a culture of exploitation, and they raised questions that can only be answered by unsealing the files. And yet, when lawmakers were given a chance to face those questions head-on, many turned away. Some even publicly claimed to support transparency, saying put everything out there, only to take procedural actions that avoided the vote entirely. Words said one thing, actions said another. The contradictions became impossible to ignore. Survivors noticed. Journalists noticed. Ordinary Americans noticed. Because at its core, this isn't a political issue. It's a moral one. Survivors aren't asking for revenge. They're asking for truth. They're asking for acknowledgement. They're asking for a country that doesn't protect predators simply because exposing them would be inconvenient. And for the public, the refusal to release the files carries a different consequence. It erodes trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in leadership. Trust in the justice system. Every time power is used to keep information hidden, people lose a little more faith that the system works the same for all of us. Which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If transparency threatens reputations, what does that say about the reputations themselves? What makes this moment even more critical is how carefully the proposed legislation was crafted. It didn't expose victims. It didn't reveal identifying information. It didn't jeopardize current investigations or national security. It didn't release raw graphic details. It simply ensured that those who facilitated, profited from, or participated in Epstein's world would no longer be shielded by secrecy. The protections were narrow. The transparency was intentional. And yet, even that was too much for 51 senators. Merkley said he hopes his colleagues will search their hearts, reconsider, and bring the amendment forward again. Because at some point, a country must decide whether accountability is reserved for the powerless or applied universally, especially when the stakes involve networks that may have spanned governments, corporations, philanthropies, and global elites. Equal justice under law is meant to be a promise, not a marketing slogan. But right now that promise is cracking, and the public's role is larger than ever. Ordinary citizens have more power than they realize. When enough voices call their representatives, demand transparency, and refuse to let powerful people hide behind procedure, the political cost of secrecy rises. Survivors' advocacy groups have fought for years for these files to be released. Independent journalists have followed the paper trail through legal obstacles, stonewalled agencies, and hidden archives. When everyday people add their voice, the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Imagine a country where victims are finally listened to, where investigative files aren't stored away because they might embarrass someone with influence, where the justice system isn't divided into two tiers, one for the everyday person and one for the well-connected. That world isn't unrealistic. It's simply inconvenient for the people who fear what transparency might expose. The vote wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much louder conversation about whether accountability stops where power begins, and whether Americans will allow secrecy to prevail because it's easier than confronting what might lie inside those files. Justice delayed is justice denied. Not just for victims, but for a society that claims to value truth. If you believe transparency still matters, if you believe equal justice under law should apply to everyone, if you believe survivors deserve more than closed doors and buried documents, then make your voice heard. Call your representatives. Share this information. Stay engaged. Don't let the pressure fade. Because the only thing more dangerous than what's in those files is a country that decides it doesn't want to know. If this helped you understand what really happened behind the scenes, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. Your support helps keep this conversation alive and brings us one step closer to the transparency the public deserves.